Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
The Reverend Steven Steinberger-Domienik currently serves a congregation in the Episcopal Diocese of Michigan. Stephen was raised Roman Catholic, and after graduating from the University of Detroit, he initially pursued ordination in one of the Catholic religious orders. He decided to leave for a variety of reasons, and found his first job as a community mental health case manager, working with homeless street people in the inner city of Cincinnati. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Hi, Tim. Thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate this opportunity to have a conversation with you.
Well, I wonder if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about how you got into the work you're doing and what drives your passion for it.
Yes. Well, to begin with, I was raised in a large Roman Catholic family. And so my parents were very invested in their faith. And they used to take me when I was in fourth grade through eighth grade in a parochial school to work as an altar boy for daily mass, Monday through Saturday, every day. So they would wake me up early. They would leave my younger sisters at home, something we probably wouldn't be able to do today, and take me down the street to our local parish. And so at a very early age, I became embedded, I believe, in religious tradition, in the mystery of the Roman Church and in God, and trying to find my way as a person of faith throughout grade school. That changed some when I went to high school. I went to a public high school, and church started to fall away for me a little bit. So we just went occasionally on Sundays or Saturday evenings. And then as I progressed to college, I pretty much put my faith practice and tradition on the side. And I really dove right into the college scene, which was too much of everything, too much having a good time, not enough studying, and just enjoying the time away from family and friends. And there is a point to this, because my third year into college, I had a very big conversion experience with God. And I thought that my life was changing, was coming to an end, and I had a real fear of death. And so as I finished up my third year in college, I came back home, moved back in with my parents. And what I did was to start to discern what this whole thing about God was. And a friend of mine from high school I ran into was a dancer at Juilliard, said, I go to this place. It's a Catholic religious order here in Michigan, and I'm part of that. Why don't you come with me? It sounds like you're having a hard time. So I went with him. And for a couple of days, we were quiet, solitude, and had time to talk with people. And what I realized was, when I talked to this one Roman Catholic priest, he said, so what are you doing here? What's going on in your life? And all of a sudden, all of this stuff that I had inside of me just kind of spewed out. And he listened for probably an hour and a half or so, didn't say a word, just listened, nodded occasionally. And then at the end of it, he said to me, Stephen, it sounds like you need to make your relationship with God right. You need to be able to forgive yourself, and you need to be able to feel forgiven and loved by God. And I was thinking, are you kidding me? There's nothing to that. What are you talking about? And he said, would you be willing to try this with me? And I said, okay, I'm here. I'll try it. And so he led me through a prayer, and it was really an absolution. It was really the sacrament of penance or reconciliation. And I had such a profound experience of being loved and cared for and forgiven for everything I've done, and for being able to forgive myself and to let it go. That changed my life. And here I am. I just finished my junior year in college, and now this whole world opens up, and everything that I was looking at doing before didn't seem to have any importance. And so I pursued this relationship with this God, which was different than this relationship with the Roman Catholic Church and, being there at church all the time. And what I found was that I needed to change and alter my relationships, not only with myself, with God, but the world, created world, and with other people. Because I was out of balance. I was out of sync. I was not in a place of homeostasis as we think about talking and trying to center ourselves. And so that led me to reading and prayer and retreats and trying to figure out what this spiritual path was. It ultimately led me to this culmination of joining this Catholic religious order group here in Michigan. And so I spent a couple of years here, and they ultimately had me move down to Cincinnati, where I continued in this process and this training. I never made it to the seminary part where you study theology and then become ordained. I opted out for a lot of different reasons, and I became engaged to a woman that I met after I left. She was Southern Baptist, and I was still very Roman Catholic. And as we dated and continued to fall in love and decided that we wanted to make a life together, we had to find a religious tradition, a home, because I didn't like going to the Baptist church. She didn't really care for coming to the Roman Catholic Church. So we found the Episcopal Church, and that was in Cincinnati. And it was a freeing experience for both of us. We were both able to find parts of our tradition in that, both Catholic and Protestant, and the people were wonderful and inclusive and welcoming of all people, whether you were gay, straight, poor, rich, it didn't matter. Whatever culture you came from, you were accepted. And that taught me very early on that part of being in right relationship with God and feeling healthy and centered was, how are we with other people? How do we connect with folks? How do we relate to them? And what is our perspective on them? And so it got me thinking about this right relationship, about perspective about life and with God. And so I started to pursue that, and some time in the Episcopal Church, and then I had to find a calling, right? So prior to my meeting this woman who I married, I was living in the inner city of Cincinnati with a couple of Roman Catholic priests, and they saw a need to start helping these people that lived on the streets. Back in those days, we called them SMD, severely mentally disabled, or CMI, chronically mentally ill. And these were street folks who lived in the parks and shelters. And so these three priests, they went ahead and they bought a building and they started housing people. And it started to grow and it became a nonprofit organization. And I started working with folks and seeing what their struggles were like. A lot of these folks had come out of the deinstitutionalization for people who had been in long-term psychiatric state facilities for long periods of time. And they were trying to adjust. And of course, as you know, the mental health field came out with all of those new drugs that people were able to use, so we could treat people in community mental health centers rather than in the state psychiatric institutions. So, things like Trilofan and Haldol and Prolixin and all of those other psychotropics were being used for folks. And so part of my job, I became a case manager for these folks that were street people and connected to a mental health center. And so my job was to go into these state psychiatric facilities, meet with people who were going to be discharged, and operate as a case manager, find people housing, Social Security entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, all the things that they needed to do to be successful in the community. So I started working on those issues, which led me eventually to to move to a halfway house where I worked with folks who were not that severe and were not street people, but who had other challenges, right? Your everyday run-of-the-mill person who came from a good family or a traumatized family, it didn't matter, but who had been hospitalized, but not long-term, that were coming and stepping down to a halfway house before they went back home or to their jobs or wherever. And I worked with the director of that halfway house, who was a licensed professional counselor. And I really liked her skill set, how she worked with people. And so I went ahead and I said, I want to be like her. And I found a program at the University of Cincinnati in mental health counseling and jumped in, got a master's degree, and then graduated in 91 and started working as a therapist. I was trained with DSM-3, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 3rd edition revised. And so that was an eye-opening experience for me, because all of a sudden they had these classifications of all these symptoms, right? And so if you met 4, 5, 6 criteria in this classification, you were then considered whatever the label was, fill in the blank. And that never made much sense to me, because I thought, here are people, yeah, they're exhibiting some of these symptoms, but what's going on in their life? The trauma that they've experienced, or the things that they're encountering that are difficult. And what I found was, working as a case manager, as person in the halfway house, as a therapist, was that there was always 2 things that were commonality. The first was that they had experienced some sort of trauma. And, we think about trauma as something very traumatic, whether that's abuse or violence or war, something big. But for every person, trauma can be very different. So what could be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person. So it's hard to judge that. But somebody always had something in their lives that was a problem. And the second thing was that their relationships were out of joint. They were not aligned. They were not centered in their relationships with themselves, with other people, the world, and with God. And so I tried to work with that. But as a mental health therapist, you're not supposed to be working with God unless the client, as we called clients rather than patients, would bring up. We could ask about certain things, but really to try to work with them on their spiritual lives was a no-no. So I was told I could never do that. And so that was difficult for me. So I had to monitor their medication, go in with the psychiatrist and report back. And then it was always a medication checkup or alteration and trying to get the right combination of meds. And I saw that with adults, and I saw that with children. And a lot of these young children, they were put on heavy duty psychotropics that were really not tested long-term for children. And it just tore my heart apart, thinking that these kids were taking these medicines so that they would calm down and wouldn't be problematic in the classroom or at home, because that's what their parents wanted, when all they, in my mind, really needed was to have their relationships with their parents, or that they did or didn't have, kind of straightened out and brought back to a center with themselves, with their family members, with their teachers. Something was out of line, something was out of whack. And rather than trying to help with their outburst and their behavior, that they were reacting to something, how they were feeling things that they couldn't articulate, we medicated them. And I had a huge problem with that. And so I never wanted to really participate with that ongoing thing. And I struggled as a therapist in the mental health field because of that reason. And so halfway through my career, my wife, I told her I wanted to get back into the religious part of my life. And I wanted to pursue ordination in the Episcopal Church because I thought that I could make a difference from a spiritual side, and having the skill set that you'll learn as a therapist and through graduate school and through practice, that I could meld the two in a different way, that I didn't have to diagnose anybody. I didn't have to bill insurance. I didn't have to follow all of those rules with the medication and psychiatrist that I didn't adhere to and didn't like anyways. And so when I went to go to be approved back in the mid 90s, I was approved to go to seminary, but my wife at the time said, this isn't a good time for us to move away. I just started a new job. Our daughter's in middle school. We need to stay here. So I had to put that on hold. And for the next 10 years, I just kept working the mental health job that I had, but it was wearing. And then a tragedy happened in our lives. My wife at the time was killed in a car accident. And that really led to some changes in my life and my daughter's life, as you can imagine. But what happened was, I started phasing out of the therapy because it was very painful and very difficult. And so I went through a process of grieving and had my own therapist to go to, and I worked through that. And at the end of that time, I contacted my bishop and said, I'm at a point in my life where things are different. I would like to look at this ordination piece again. And he said, I've been waiting for you to call. I knew you would. And we talked, and he put me right back into this ordination process. And I had an opportunity to do my seminary training in Boston. My daughter was just starting college in Northampton, Massachusetts, 2 hours from Boston, where I was going to seminary. And so I moved to Boston. We sold our house in Cincinnati, and I moved there. And that seminary training was amazing and immeasurable in my life, because not only are you getting the theological training and history, you're also working on your interior spiritual life, which is what I really needed to do to right myself from the loss of my wife in this accident. And I could see how people could really, a trauma like that, become extremely depressed and sink in and not be able to function and go seek pills to try to help them through this. But for me, it was about finding the right balance again and being in right relationship with God and my deceased wife. And so finding that, and that's what seminary also helped me to do. But what I realized in that was that a lot of times, even in our Old Testament and Christian scriptures now, we see that the priests were really in charge of the healing, the medicine, and the work with transforming and healing people. So a lot of the dietary restrictions that we see were really an attempt to help people with their diet, right? We talk about diet all the time. Don't eat this because this isn't helpful for you. It can cause illness. It can cause sickness. Do this. And let's pray. Let's do spiritual things. And as we progressed into studies in scripture, we had the New Testament, obviously, and we hear that Jesus is healing people through prayer, and restoring them to community was always there, restoring them to right relationship with themselves and right relationship with their families, their neighbors, and with God. That was the key for me in theology, to realize that healing takes place with this. And as you know, and I know most of our listeners know, that for many cultures and societies throughout the ages, healing and medicine were done from a spiritual point. They were done from the religious people in that tradition, whether they were shamans, medicine men, priests. It didn't matter, whatever their religious rituals and rites were for whatever society. That's where people went when they were distressed, when they were physically ill, when they were emotionally, psychologically ill and distressed. That's where they would go, to religion. And that's where it went, usually up until probably the Enlightenment, right? And then we had this outburst of technology and science and medicine, 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, really focused on medicine. And so it shifted from theology, religion, and spiritual healing to harder science. We have to be able to prove it, we have to be able to measure it and see it, and we have to do it through scientific practices and methods. And so we shifted how we do healing in our world from the religious part to the scientific part. And
let me just interrupt you there, because Dr. Michael Rice is one of my favorite teachers, and he says, it's not that we shifted how we do healing, it's that we shifted away from healing into treatment.
Oh,
right?
I like that. Yeah,
that's good. I know it's compatible with what you're talking about. That's why I'm just going to give you that little thing. We treat a symptom, but we don't do any healing. We don't look at the whole person. We don't look at, as you're talking about, the relationships with myself, with my friends and family, with my community. And that, I just wanted to add that little clarification point. I don't want to derail you too much from the path you're on. We really aren't doing healing.
Right.
In the medical model, what we're doing is treating symptoms.
Yes, I agree 100% with you. Thank you for that clarification. I agree. And so we shifted. And so the pendulum swung from the religious, the spiritual healing to treatment of symptoms focused on hard science and what we could measure and what we could prove. And so we drill down. As you know, there are so many specialties, right? In medicine these days, there's a specialty for everything. And so we now have a specialty for our brains, where we think our emotions, our feelings, our psychology, treatment, thinking that this is a brain thing. So we've classified now all of this internal stuff as brain problems or biological. And being part of that conversation, is it nurture or is it nature? Is it biology or is it context and environment that really causes our distress, that we think about things in a different way, that we have these relationships that are broken or severed, or we're traumatized? Does that create the symptoms, or is it an internal something, biology in our brain, that causes these symptoms that we really can't cause and show yet? Because, as you know, our diagnostic and statistical manual for mental and emotional disorders doesn't show causes. It's just classifications of outward signs that you can, and symptoms that you can see and measure and classify. So what is the real cause of it? And we really don't say that. We think it's biology, and we try to look at the science and the synapses and try to find medicine to change neurons and messages and all of those things. But is that really where it is, or is it in other areas that's causing the distress? And I think it's something else that's causing the distress. So as our treatment of these symptoms has been focused, it's really been focused on there. And I think it's fascinating that, you know, this really came about from the late 1800s, when we were classifying people with different things, dementia, whatever, idiocy, and it didn't develop. So our first diagnostic and statistical manual came out in 1952. We're imposing a hard science medical thing, along with the what then was probably the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, the 6th edition or so, with those two coming around the same time, to say we're going to try to classify all these symptoms and distress as medical things, as diseases. And so we're going to try to work that. And so I think that happened. But you know, that ICD manual started off in, what was that called? The International List of Causes of Death, and kind of morphed into a classification system through the World Health Organization that we can all use. But it's a classification of that. And our DSM books, now we're working on what, 5R, 6, I don't even know, because I'm not working with it now, where they conflict sometimes. And it wasn't until the 50s that the International Classification of Diseases started to include these mental disorders as they were seen. And so from then, we've really focused on the science and biology, and we've seen this influx of medication, as I was referring to earlier, that that's what our focus is. And that's what psychiatry unfortunately does. I know there's a lot of good psychiatrists, I know some personally, who try to treat the whole person and do other things, which is great. I wish more would do that. But there's still a lot that just focus on the symptoms. I'll prescribe a pill, and then you go away and I see the next person, where I think we're missing the boat on this. So I think the pendulum.
So this idea, because I want to bring you back to something that's been stuck in my head since you mentioned it. You mentioned that when you were younger and you were in third year of college, that you realized something was off in your relationships.
Yes.
What, if you have identified this, what caused such a derailing or a lack of connection in your relationships, and what did you do to correct it? And how does that work with how you're working with people today as whole people in relationship with their bodies, their minds, their community, etc.?
Sure. Good question. Thank you. So for me, I was raised with, a moral center or a moral code or a sense of, to be a person in right relationship with God, you follow a certain, I just call it a moral code. And what I realized in college was that I was throwing those codes out left and right. And I didn't feel good about myself. I was doing things, treating people in ways that I thought, this is really despicable. I didn't commit any crimes, but it was a moral thing that the way I treated and talked to people, and how I treated and talked to myself, and my expectations of myself were not being met. And part of that came from my parents' upbringing of me, and part of it was the center, and part of it was what I was taught that being in relationship with God meant. And I was missing the boat. I just wasn't there. And so I felt like I was not a good person for that. And so I needed to redo that and get back to that center to say, here's my sense of self, and here is what I believe and hold that I need to do in order to be able to function in this world in a way that I felt good about, and that I didn't get upset about, because I could have easily gone down and said, I'm a bad person, a drink or smoke or whatever it was, to numb those feelings inside about me that I thought were wrong. Something about me wasn't lovable. Something about me wasn't, it was off. It was just off. And so I needed to find that center again and to feel that. And once I felt that love of God, that I was okay, that I was a good person, that I believed that, everything changed. Everything changed, because then I could work with my stuff and bring that into right relationship with me and with others. And I think people, our expectations are off all the time. And, our expectations here, realities down below. And it's this gap that we have problems with, and people experience that all the time. And I think that's a big part of where people get depressed, because their expectations don't meet.
Excuse my interruption, but did you find some kind of a tool or an assessment device, or how was it that you woke up and realized that you were so out of alignment with what your own core values were?
It was, again, I was feeling miserable after my third year in college. And so I was telling my friend this, and he is the one that suggested I come with him. And when I spoke to that priest, he just said, so how are you doing? What's up? Why are you here? What's going on in your life, basically? And it was at that moment that I started spewing all of this stuff. It just came up. There was no tool. It was just a question he asked. And at the end of all of that, he said to me, I think you need to reconcile your relationship with yourself, with your God, feel forgiven, and to be able to forgive yourself. That was it. So there was no paper tool. And it was that sense of prayer and entering into that all of a sudden I did. I felt loved, I felt forgiven, and I felt like I forgave myself for doing those things. And that lifted this burden, this darkness, this stuff that was going on.
So it seems like it worked pretty well for you, that you're being an introspective person, somebody who clearly likes to talk, that he pulled the plug out and here came this thing flooding out of
Okay.
you. As
Yeah.
you know, a lot of times we deal with people and they either aren't as introspective or they're not that free with their speech.
Hmm.
What do you do when you're working with people to help them explore what their relationship is to their values, to themselves, to the world around them? What, what kind of uh, tools or structure do you use or flow do you
Hmm.
use when you're working with people?
Yes, that's a good question. And to be honest with you, Tim, I use the principles from AA, the 12-step program, because in my mind, that is a spiritual program. And Bill Wilson and Bob Smith hit it right on the head in my mind. They didn't focus on pills for people who were addicts or alcoholics. They focused on their spiritual selves, and they were trying to right that. And so you look at any of those principles, they're all about admitting we don't have any power over alcohol. But if you could substitute any word in there at all, I don't have any power over my depression. I don't have any power over my anxiety. I don't have any power over my hallucinations. Whatever word you want to put in there, you can. And my life has become unmanageable. And I have to believe that there's a power outside of myself that could restore me. And so I just kind of listen to where people are and I pick one of those tools, one of those principles, one of those steps, and I'll talk to them just about that. And we'll focus on that. And I never tell them it's from AA. I'm just asking a question, just like that priest asked me. And those are the principles, those are the tools that I use because it all leads back again to an understanding of right relationship with God, however I understand God and myself and with others. I ask for forgiveness and I forgive others who have offended me and I apologize to others whom I've hurt. And I take that moral inventory of one of the steps as well. So those are the tools that I use with people. And it becomes a very spiritual thing. And with folks that are church members or churchgoers, the God language is really easy. With people who aren't churchgoers and who may not have that, then I use the higher power or the language that way as well. So that's what I work with people on.
Wonderful. And if you're saying that, I would assume that you've come to understand that there's a depth and a profundity to that set of tools that years of working with it leave you still exploring more. It's an endless cycle of
Yes.
going through the steps.
Yes.
We have a lot of people that understand very little about it and AA, and they say, well, take me through the steps and then I'll be done. But anybody who really understands the steps understand it's just like any other really good tool that I might pick up and use on myself. The next time I go to pick up that set of tools, I'm a different person.
Mm-hmm.
I have a different level of willingness to see the things that the fearful part of my mind has been blocking from me. And so it's great to hear that you're using that so well. Some of the most effective healers and teachers that I've run across have come through my office as, quote, patients. And they are the people who have a high level of intellectual capacity that they've focused on the 12 steps and applying them in their lives and then teaching them to others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those principles were not made up, by those two founders back in 1935. Those are spiritual truths, I think, that have been around this millennium, right? That they've put together and they coalesced and they did a great job with it. Because in my mind, I could have a Sunday worship and all of these things fit into our scriptures and what our faith life is like. So the folks in my congregation don't realize it most of the time because I talk about it from scripture point of view, how we forgive others, how we're forgiven, right relationships. But those are the exact same things that they're talking about in AA. They are one and the same. Which context do we do it in, and what semantics we use are immaterial. And in my mind, this doesn't have to be just a Christian focus. I mean, and it's not, because a lot of people who aren't Christian use these steps for AA. And I've often thought, wouldn't this be great to start off a worship service saying, hi, everybody, I'm a Christian and I don't have any power over, my life is unmanageable, but I need to do some of these things to follow them. So I think they're very applicable. Yeah.
Well, and it reminds me a lot of Dr. Mark Hyman, who is an MD, and he was an MD, and then he had some serious physical ailments that nothing in the medical field could treat. So that led him on a search for something outside the traditional medical model. And he found health. He found that if you start treating the whole person,
Yes.
there's a very different result than if you're just chasing symptoms. And he said in an interview once that we understand what it takes to live a healthy human life, happy human life. It isn't just food and water and shelter and sleep. It's also a sense of purpose, connection to community, a sense of love. And
Yes.
these things as a whole picture, when you start helping people look at their relationship to each of these different areas, now you've got a whole range of places where you can make an intervention, just a little tweak here or a little tweak there. And as you're talking about, you get into that balance or that homeostasis. So the idea isn't just related to the 12 steps or any religious perspective.
No.
It's well known, has been known for thousands of years, that we aren't just flesh and blood.
Right.
And simply supplying nutrients to a child, a newborn infant, without any connection or physical affection isn't enough to keep that baby thriving.
Right. Yes, I agree totally with you. And so that's why I think that the pendulum has swung to the other side with this whole medical model of treating symptoms, and it needs to come back. It needs to swing back to the center. And I see it starting to happen with organizations such as Journey's Dream and many other groups out there too. We're starting to go back to look at that whole person. That's why you see treatment modalities like mindfulness and yoga and all of those things that try to get you in touch with your spiritual side and with your physical side. And it's not focused on those symptoms per se, but it's focused more on bringing us back to center. And there's lots of ways to do that. So I think we're getting there, but I wish that more of us would be talking about this. And we come at it from different points of view, from a scientific point of view, because I know you have guests on your show that come from a real science base, but they're seeing it just like you're talking about, and they're trying to swing back. And people from a more religious or spiritual perspective, like myself and others, who want to bring that back. And we certainly aren't anti-science. That's not it at all. I don't want to give that impression, but we need to have that balance and that integration so that we can talk about spirituality and our relationship with God and our relationship with ourselves and forgiveness, which is so important, and how that fits into our scientific understandings of things that we do.
So I'm aware of the time, and we have just maybe 4 or 5 minutes left. Let me ask you, is there some aspect of the work you do with people, whether it's from the spiritual perspective or the emotional, psychological, or relationship perspective, that we haven't even talked about yet that you want to make sure we get in here?
I think it's about the whole relationships with people in church, because I talk to so many people outside of my congregation that say, I don't want to have anything to do with church, or I don't believe in that. That stuff just isn't for me. And my point is, you are a spiritual person. No matter if you go to an institutional church or a congregation or a parish or a temple or a mosque, you are a spiritual person. And you are living a life of faith, but but part of that is being in touch with something greater than yourself. If you think that you and this life is all that there is, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. Is my thinking. I don't tell people that, but we need to touch base with that spiritual side of ourselves. And so people who have fallen away from churches say, well, I don't agree with that at all. But my sense is trying to get them to understand that you have a relationship with God, with yourself, with others, that is the heart of what our religious traditions do. So my goal is not so much to get people to come back into church buildings. Don't tell my bishop that. But my goal is to be able to help people see their connection to something greater, their God in their lives. Because if they do, and they can tap into that sense of love and that sense of forgiveness, their world is going to change. And that's where I think healing and wholeness and transformation comes in. So folks that don't have anything to do with church, I would encourage them, look at your spiritual side. Talk to somebody, a trusted person that you know, that can walk with you on your spiritual journey. However you find that. There are many paths. There's not just one way. So find that and walk it and read it and live it and live into it. And I guarantee you, it will be life-changing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I know it's not what a lot of people would expect from our Journey Stream podcast, but it's essential for us as human beings to recognize this whole picture. And I appreciate your willingness to share, and I look forward to the next time we get to talk.
Okay, I do too, Tim. Thank you very much for your time.
Steven Steinberger-Domienik was raised Roman Catholic, and after graduating from the University of Detroit, he initially pursued ordination in one of the Catholic religious orders. He decided to leave for a variety of reasons and found his first job as a community mental health case manager working with homeless street people in the inner city of Cincinnati. At the time, this specific population was labeled chronically mentally ill or severely mentally disabled. All of these folks had lived a portion of their lives in a state-run psychiatric facility. Stephen went on to obtain his master's degree in mental health counseling from the University of Cincinnati and worked for 15 years as a mental health therapist, serving children, adolescents, and adults. He believed that there was a better way to support these individuals and help them find healing rather than symptom management through the continuous use of psychotropic medications. Stephen's initial calling to the priesthood returned, but this time it was with the Episcopal Church, and he did his seminary training in Boston. It was here that he learned the healing power of the divine could heal the wounds of people who were experiencing mental health challenges, rather than just managing their symptoms. No matter what the trauma, loss, or pain was in people's lives, transformation could occur as the spiritual work continued. As a parish priest, he tested out his theory and found that as people worked to restore their relationships with themselves, others, God, and creation, that their lives were being changed.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.